If for each of us a rope could swing us long and light across a widening trough of all that fails us in our lives, I would want to land upon the Isle of Echo, lush with repetition, green with being original in birth, and twice the twin a wave might dance along the scurry. I would want a canyon tall for hawks to carry, long the deep tattoo of voices on the air. I would want an ear to hear what words to read again to memory, what verse to carol, thoughts to root. Before the sparrow's flight the mind has taken comes to rest on truth. I would want to hear a vowel repeat in consonance with alliteration's frothy throat. And should the landing fail its footing, I would want to know what inspiration in shorter flight one syllable might repeat, as in the swash the flat stone makes to skip across the light in water, or the voice the wind gives to birch and linden. Poetry is where I live. It's my heart. Even though I was writing it very badly, it didn't mean much, except for me, especially during the period of college. I remember during the Vietnam period, and during the civil rights marches and the feminist marches. I was so aware of many of the balladeers. And then when Bob Dylan came into being as one of those troubadours, you know, who sang his music, poetry to the music, there was an invitation for 4 of us to go to Moscow to read for almost 8, maybe 10,000 people in a hockey stadium. I was even more aware how much power there was to that oral tradition, and I began to listen to it more, and especially during those Vietnam period, the tenor of the words in my own writing began to change. I wanted to say something about I was against the war, and I was for the civil rights marches, and so I wanted to say something with words, and I think it just took me into writing with the music and hearing that Slovak rhythm, and I think finally, I just began to write.
You've read poetry for 5 heads of state.
Right.
Well, you're universally recognized as a literary ambassador, and what do you think it is about your poetry that crosses boundaries?
I wanted to be universal. You know, that word was very important to me. In studying literature and reading as a young man, and even in college, I was reading comparative literature. I was always reading other authors, Pablo Neruda. I was reading, Kundera from the Czech Republic, Havel, you know, everybody I could, and the Russian poets and writers. So I think I began to understand that you had to write, if you were going to write, you had to write to be able to cross boundaries, as you said, cross boundaries in time. My mother and father came in 1929 in the middle of the Depression. They came to America. It took a lot of courage because the Depression was very bad here too. But when they left everyone behind, all their own mothers and fathers. They left their families, their brothers and sisters behind, knowing they would probably never see them again. And that's what happened. They didn't. My parents came back 40 years later only because I had brought them back. I bought their passports, I bought their tickets. I brought them back 40 years. My father was working in the steel mills. I think what happens with me is that I always admired their courage. I mean, they were married 50 years, 13 children. 3 of them they brought from here on the ship Aquitania to America. They came in 1929, and the courage that they had shown, I wanted to understand what that was like. I wanted to be able to come back to the villages to see my beginnings, that I would know my roots, that I would understand my roots. So I could speak in a very bad Slovak, Vychodnarsky dialect. But I think for me, it was important for me to know how and where my parents lived and how they lived.
Trika, Jimmyho, tak toho my voláme, si pamätám už v podstate veľmi dávno, pretože oni tam chodili pravidelne už niekoľko rokov. A v podstate ešte máme aj fotografie, na ktorých sme malé deti, možno 3-4 ročné. A je tam striko Jim a so svojou manželkou.
Ja budem čítať básni Michalose, nemôžem
My sme veľmi prekvapení, pretože vie rozprávať tým dialektom, nárečím, ale rozpráva veľmi dobre, všetci ho rozumieme.
A ona žala hore. A on jemu 2 razy nám dezeli a ženáte už boli. On 2 razy.
Mňa vlastne prekvapuje v tej jeho poézii, ako on je spätý s pravdou. Všetko, o čom píše, je z jeho života. Buď je to o jeho rodičoch, alebo jeho deťoch, alebo vyslovene sú to jeho zážitky, niečo, čo on hlboko prežíva, čo veľa básnikov už nerobí v dnešnej dobe. Proste nie sú to také hlboké zážitky, je to už proste niečo, či už je to aj o politické témy, ale aj keď dáva tie politické témy, aj tak to má nejako pospletané so svojou rodinou. Stále je to nejaké proste niečo, čo vychádza z jeho spomínok alebo z jeho života.
A wonderful thing happened. Václav Havel came to Los Angeles, to the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, and they arranged a meeting for me and him. It was just the most wonderful meeting because I had written against the regime. My books were banned, my plays and my poetry were banned here in this country, Czechoslovakia. After all of the years that he spent in jail, I remember I had to report to the police. I had to come every police station. I had to tell them I was in town, whether it was in Humene, whether it was in Prešov, no matter where I went. I just remember the oppression. I remember why it was that I wrote the poems that I did against communism, against totalitarianism. He represented, for me, the moral center of a whole country. He represented the moral center. So to meet him, and it was a request made from his side that we should meet, the first thing he did was he put out his hand to me as the president, and he said, "We are colleagues." I'll never forget that. We are colleagues. And he just drew me in and he said, "I am asking all Czechoslovaks to donate something to the country, to this new wonderful country." He didn't mean money, he said, not money, something of you. So I told him, "Well, you know me as a writer, but I'm also an educator." He said, "That's it. You will come back and you will teach at our university." So for 20 years, I teach every summer at Charles University, donating. At the beginning, I was donating all my time, everything.
I think Jim is probably one of the most extraordinary poets I've had the pleasure of knowing and reading. I've known his poetry for many years, even before I met him. And what I sort of equate him very much towards is the same style and passion and understanding for humanity that other poets such as Pablo Neruda, Garcia Lorca had.
I think James Reagan writes poetry of the highest order. I think his work is really of the highest order, in that his contemporaries really are timeless in a sense, that the language that he uses, the high diction that he uses, the lyric imagery, the lyric language, and his concerns as a poet, I think, are timeless and also above geography. In my mind, I've compared him to Rilke.
Part of this wonderful invitation that I received from him was that I would be distinguished visiting professor and that I was invited to stay at his childhood home where he grew up.
Jim je fajn člověk a my máme rádi dobrý lidi, takže když se naskytla příležitost. Kromě toho já mám takovou nostalgii po americké angličtině, když jsem tam studoval a tak je to příjemné se s ním bavit. A on jako se ukazuje, že je neobyčejně rád tady, jezdí sem rád, bydlí v našem domě vždycky, si to vždycky předjedná, aby příští rok mohl zase. Má vyhlídku na Petřín a píše básně. Mám rád, když recituje své verše. On totiž má takový zvyk, že kdykoliv čte svoji básně, oni většinou mluví z paměti, že jo? Ale tak má k tomu takový úvod, takový nějaký příběh, který se udál a stavět.
And I saw the widening abyss between the rich and the poor. And when I came here, I watched the dissolution of a whole country that I grew up with, that I love so dearly, this huge, beautiful country in the center of Europe. And so, as I sat at the Lavka, I saw the hunger wall, and the waitress began to point and say, oh, that's called the hunger wall. King Charles felt so sorry for the poor that he had them build this wall just so he could pay them.
Tak má taky příběh odtud. Má jednu báseň o 4 světových stranách a to ho inspirovalo. Současně umí takovou krásnou lámanou češtinu nebo slovenštinu, umí přednášet a je velice přátelský.
In my family, I was looked on as that other child, questionable offspring, the only one to go into the arts. The others were all in engineering and the empirical sciences. But my father, because he always said we were children of consonants and misplaced vowels. You know, if you have Czech names, Polish names, Russian, Hungarian, there's always many consonants. And he had the wonderful joke about on ourselves. We'd play in terms of the Czech immigrant who comes to America and goes to the optometrist, and the optometrist puts the chart up and says, can you read the third line on the chart? He said, read it, I know him. So.
Jim Regan tak je ten nesmírně zajímavý příspěvek, který si myslím i v tomto našem československém kontextu hraje důležitou a můžu si říct velice pozitivní roli, aspoň na mě to tak vždycky působilo. Si myslím, že my skutečně potřebujeme partnery tohoto typu, abychom se uměli na sebe podívat. Samozřejmě specifickou roli hrají političtí komentátoři, ale básníci, to je něco opravdu, řekl bych, neobvyklého a velice důležitého. Pokud to můžu posoudit, poezie Jima Regana je na jedné straně krásně americká, moc hezky se to poslouchá v té angličtině, ale současně se do toho prolínají všechny jeho postřehy, ať už prostě směřují k jeho zkušenostem z dětství nebo k jeho setkáním s tím naším prostředím v současnosti.
As if to live were time enough, we would have them end beyond their means. Hours long they scrabble onto walls and mirrors the words they would like to leave us, the haunted prints of thought falls drifting out of mind's possession like nostalgia or grief. The world has lost its face. I always believed that the poet should want to move the minds of kings. That my goal, at least, was to be able to visit many countries, see many people, but to also influence world leaders. I lived in a very political world in the 60s, so I grew up in that background, in a Cold War. So my impulse was to take it to the world, to take poetry and the arts to the larger community.
Thank you very much.
Hardly had she heard the spring geese bray to horses interloping down the hill at dusk, when walking, a swift wrist riding the sweat from his brow, he came as promised to her second dance. to muscle up the brawling thugs who bow to still her breath. But giving all the chance she couldn't know her mind was giving, she stole each offered hand, the boys declared, numbed as they were by fear or simply heartbroken. Here in my home, this is in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. I was born here, in this home right here. This was the first home. My parents came to Pittsburgh only because my father's sister, Teresa Cooper, she was already here with her husband working in the steel mills. This was a wonderful book. It was just called Slovak Pittsburgh. Actually, there's a photo I didn't even realize of the family, our family in this book. And then my other brothers and sisters are right here, so they actually used this. And it was a nice tribute to all the Slovaks who were in the Pittsburgh area working in the steel mills.
In Duquesne, where we grew up, there was a strong ethnic melting pot of Slovaks, Poles, Serbians, a lot of traditions that were kept, especially during holidays. And it's important for us to pass those traditions on to another generation, our children. They've been able to see where their great-grandparents and their grandparents were born.
At night, in the ward room practicing death, my father, with owed breath tucked in the bed of his lungs, learned the punctual notes of leaving. The dark that coal excels before the last grind of fire whittles it to space. In memory, he owed the dark, each splice of rusted rail and sagging boxcar. Breath, as in the sleep of legs, he saved for the mind's departure.
Kolo, kolo, mlynské, za 4 lynské, kolo sa nám polamalo a do vody popadalo.
I think since it was our dad's first language, it's something we had heard before. So it wasn't completely this new thing that we had no idea. And he used to teach us, like he taught Tara all the body parts when she was little, and so we knew a little bit. So it wasn't scary, you know, to be here and interact with them speaking it.
And it's part of the culture, and that's important to us. So I know even in our dad's poems, you know, he uses words and songs, and there's the lyrical quality that the language has that I'm sure really influences the poetry. And so I know even in my own thesis, I did a lot of that to bring the culture in.
I think it's just something else that makes up who we are, so it's normal and it is like home.
I loved language. There was something about using language that can give you nuance. It could give you several levels. But to be able to use words in their purest forms, the most beautiful 2 words are truth, and this is what I live by. I write the truth. Passion. To live a life of passion.
Čo ma na jeho poézii, hlavne teda na jeho poézii, veľmi mi zaimponovalo, že vlastne sa cez tú poéziu vracia k Slovensku. Že hľadá tie korene nie v zmysle rodiny, to tiež pochopiteľne, ale v zmysle nejakých intelektuálnych prúdov, cez ľudové umenie, cez svojich rodičov, cez spomienky na detstvo. Vždy tie spomienky narážajú na niečo, čo tu ešte trošku existuje, ale už tiež odchádza. Takže on akoby pripomínal tie staré, možno niekedy aj také lyrické a také pekné časy.
Jamesa som prvýkrát stretla v roku 2003 a James tam prišiel ako konzultant. No a Ja tento svoj príbeh Dom som naozaj mala len v niekoľkých možno verziách, ale ešte som to mala v takom chaose aj sama v sebe a niektoré veci som tam cítila, aj som mala pomenované, ale nevedela som to dať dokopy. A keď som to vlastne porozprávala, tak si pamätám, že James vlastne okamžite z toho trošku neporiadku, čo som mala, vedel pomenovať podstatu, priniesol mi akoby taký univerzálnejší pohľad na ten príbeh. Vlastne pomenoval, že domy a ako tú metaforu nedostávaných domov vlastne prirovnal k zmenám, ktoré sa vlastne u nás udiali, koniec socializmu a vlastne nová nejaká éra.
It's hard to romanticize communism with people who've gone through such repression as my own family had.
I still remember being in a library in Humene, near my villages. And apparently my cousin, someone put one of my books on their bookshelf in the library. And they called me in. And they wanted to know, what is your book doing here? I had no idea. They thought I was lying. I said, I don't know. She took the book off, pulled out scissors, and there was a poem to Jan Palach. There was another poem about the Russians invading Czechoslovakia, and one about Dubček, Alexander Dubček. And she cut out the poems and put them in the basket. I remember it was like losing a child. It was like children being, and then she threw it in and she says, now it can remain. And I never saw censorship so graphic as I did then. Marco Skop always sends me his.
James Ragan bol vlastne náš prvý učiteľ scenaristiky, ako keby lektor, s ktorým sme mali taký intenzívny kurz, ktorý trval možno týždeň, sa mi zdá. James je veľmi dobrý učiteľ a vedel to veľmi jasne a akože jednoducho vysvetliť, takže my s Laurou sme boli úplne hotoví.
A James tam bol opäť v Karlových Varoch a robil tam skript doktora, priamo už na scenár, ktorý neskôr sa sfilmoval a volá sa Nebo, peklo, zem. A že sú tam isté zákonitosti, ktoré sú všeplatné a že taká tá mystika od toho odišla a zrazu som sa dokázala odosobniť a dokázala som sa na tie veci dívať inak. Tak to bola úžasná škola.
A tá srdečnosť je strašne dôležitá v tom procese výuky, lebo nejako to človeka neponižuje, má trpezlivosť, je ochotný počúvať a vlastne je to rado sa učiť. V tom to je výnimočné, že on je výborný učiteľ.
I met James originally because he was teaching at USC, University of Southern California. And I was a graduate of USC. And it was amazing. I saw him teach in class and I just thought he was amazing. And so when I wrote my book for Simon & Schuster called Let the Magic Begin, after I'd written it, he came in and he just pulled it together in ways that I had not even imagined you could make a book come together. So it was really exciting to work with him on that. To me, what he does is words are the door to the soul, but not many people have the key to the door, and he has the key. He knows how to reach a part of you that comes alive. So he's not just writing a poem. At the same time he's writing that poem, he's painting a picture, and he's filming a film. And you get to see it all come to life. So it's not just words on a page. It's a part of life that gets recreated in the most beautiful way. So to me, he's not just a poet. He's a filmmaker. He's an artist. He's a painter. He's a sculptor.
When I was 24, I had cancer. A doctor would give me an overdose of radiation for some bone spurs I had in my foot from basketball hitting the floor a lot. So it wasn't something in me, but something that was given to me. And I remember how I had to face my own mortality. And I can tell you, I thought I was living before, but the word passion has never been more important in my life than it was after that. You couldn't stop me. I was passionate about life. I wanted to be out into the world. I wanted to live poetry rather than just write it. You see, that was more of let's say, the impulse that really took me on into the international world.
He's an absolutely outstanding outstanding teacher. He's very passionate. He knows everything and communicates it to the students, and he really, really cares about his students. After class, we would go out and go to a local restaurant and sit around and talk for another few hours. And of all the teachers I've had, I have to say, I think James really cares, and not only in the classroom but outside the classroom. I studied with him in Prague in the summer program, and we traveled throughout Slovakia and Czech Republic, and we were in Paris together. Sitting in cafes, living the life of a poet.
Poetry is something you live. It's something you live every day. It's your sensitivity into the world. It's your understanding into that world. And how do you then engage that world, and how do you put it on the page to somehow reflect what you've learned, and also to share, basically, with others.
On a trip back from Prague, this could have happened at any airport at JFK, but it was at LAX. And as we waited for our luggage after 14 hours of flight, down shot a lone book of poetry by Rilke. You watch the people watch this baggage go around, and always the book, and they watch the book, and always around with the baggage, then the book. And the poem originated from the fact that I thought this was wonderful to watch these people. It was probably the first time most of them were actually forced to acknowledge literature. This is entitled Rilke on the Conveyor Belt at LAX. A rip of pages, it falls hardly noticed into motion, and down the track, unspined, it cycles time between a rucksack and laundry. A book, no thicker than a wallet or a comb, it is the unworthy carry-on newly bought, colliding with a carpet bag or steamer on the unlikely navigation into being where it's not. Each passenger has watched it circle more than once, a bold intrusion into the archipelago of things familiar. There is no fixed point of concentration, no laughter, no elation when the eyes dissect the slow descent of baggage into orbit, as if in taking up an arm strap, each handler slews a body to the spars of his shoulder. Had Rilke himself fallen unbound, lying in the United States, he would have passed unnoticed by the baggage check or porter, who fell to think it odd or such a pity to tag him at the lost and found. How many miles his words trespassed, how many cities alive unread among so many ports of authority, a gold leaf of art, so grand in the pall of memory, it gives the mind encouragement to survive.
After the first time in Hong Kong in 2001, in front of an audience of about 200 business leaders from all over Asia. A few years later, I invited him to Bangkok to speak to another 200 international business leaders. And he really brings people together. And it's Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, Thais, and of course the Americans in the group.
I was one of 13 children. 13. Yes, it was very surprising to be Jew. And we were so poor, but they forgot to tell us. I remember as a child, very early, because I had so many siblings, so many brothers and sisters, that I would escape downstairs into the basement of our home, and I would perform by myself. I would do little shows by myself, and I would put music on, and I would sing. Do you want to hear me sing?
Yes.
But I always watched film as well. But I didn't know when I was in the basement that I was already doing theater.
I came to Los Angeles from New York because my play was being done out here. The Landlord, which then became The Saints. It was produced here at the Center Theater. And I had no intention of staying here. I just came because of the play. But one of the studios came backstage, and I didn't know the language of the film industry even. And they just said to me, "We'd like to buy your property." And I still remember thinking, I just moved out here, I just came, and I thought they were talking about my house or something, and then I realized they were talking about the play. And then they asked if I could write a screenplay. I said yes. I didn't know what it looked like. And I studied it, and then finally we had a meeting, and I was suddenly involved with films by going, based on my play and my poetry even, going to Greece, and we began to shoot a film based on my play.
I loved reading poetry. They didn't even have a murder mystery in any of them, and I loved reading them. So you can tell that I was really a fan of Jim's, and still have and will always be. And then to discover that we were both Phi Beta Kappas, my goodness. And so I went to the very first meeting that I've been to since graduation from Syracuse University. I haven't been to any of the alumni events, except when Jim was going to be the speaker, I was going to go. And it was enthralling, just enthralling. I know I stood up and applauded afterward, and I'm sure everyone else did too. In fact, I was in the ladies' room when someone we both stood up in the ladies' room. That's how enthralled we were by Jim.
That's not what you're supposed to do as a woman. Not stand up in the ladies' room. He, Jim, showed me some of his unrhymed poetry. I didn't know it was poetry. He even asked me to come into one of his classes, you know, that he gave, and I wasn't sure. I was so used to doing rhymes and not just thought process, but I knew he was distinguished, and they used to call him around the world. He would go all around. He went to Yugoslavia. He went to Czechoslovakia. He spoke before the president of Czechoslovakia. But it was great. But it was such an honor to be in the presence of somebody who was so honored, but who never played the part of he was never very important. He was never snotty about what he did. He never stood on a high horse. He was just a guy. He was a guy from Pittsburgh. He was a guy who was earthy man, who had tremendous gifts. And his gift, because he wrote screenplays too, he used to ask me about his screenplays, mention plot lines, things like that. But the plot lines didn't rhyme either. So, you know how screwed up that can be. A man who writes poetry, who writes a screenplay, and it doesn't rhyme. I don't understand that.
This is where I worked for Albert S. Ruddy Productions for about 4 years. This was just when he was finishing The Godfather, so I got to be able to work with that, and then also on some of the other projects. But it was some of the best years, just working with Al and with the staff there. We had a wonderful group of people. And I know that we worked on How the West Was Won through these offices. The Longest Yard came out of here, and so many of the other projects he did. It was such a passion to create. The romanticism about it was that we would have these sessions at 6 o'clock where we would be all of us get together and have drinks with Al, and we would talk ideas.
James Reagan brought something to this business that very few people have brought. He's brought some intelligence. He's brought students who were intelligent and smart, who had a chance to make something of value.
Because I had the first office in Al Ruddy's office when you came through the door, and so yeah, it gave me a chance to create and work in film and learn about it, but also to do my writing.
We worked together, developing some material. I saw a real world-class mind as a writer and as an intellect, and just as important part as a humanist, someone who cares. James has always been someone who has been optimistic and cares about the human experience.
How can a voice reach a larger group of people and move them with good ideas? And again, the sensitivity of your time, how to reflect the temper of your times.
I became aware of all of the progressive things that President Havel was doing for the country to James, and I saw the time he was spending in Prague with the president. And it was a very exciting time. I mean, the country was becoming liberal and opening up. And the hangover from the old Iron Curtain and the war, those ideas started vanishing. And the new ideas were coming in. And someone like James brings the new ideas in. He's an amazing man. He's a gift that America got.
We tend to want to believe in ideals. We want to believe in beauty, and that I think just grows with any young man who is an artist. He's romantic because he believes in possibility. He believes in future. He believes that things can change.
I so trust him, and I respect him, the quality of his work, and just who he is.
I show you a good sky. It could hold a fleet of geese above a kite, sipping in a breeze, or foliate the wind with leaves of cherry wood and hedge. I show you a good sky. It will rain its reflection along your troubled eye, the one that blinks each time a hawk rants by. I am no one's romantic, no, I am the sky's shadow wish, writing this only to breathe its light. I show you a falling sun, passing like a lover, to be near you, allowing no star or bulb on a corner lamp to possess you as you are. Look, here I am, the sky's moon down. I will shape a horizon out of peaks like none your memory has ever carved.
When I lift my eyes, I see light above the shoulders of the sky. A million suns, all in ascension, and realize I have never seen the sun, not one in such proportion. Som napísal tú pesničku a dneska som zaspieval pre prvý čas a ten poetry sa volá ako Reflections.
It was always a great honor and enjoyment for me to talk to him and to listen to his advice and to listen to his opinions and thoughts. And so there are not many people of Czechoslovak roots like James in Los Angeles who made it in the film world. So we are very proud of you. Thank you, James.
Yes.
On the secret map of sleep, where she dreamed she was in a cloister scooping off the wet weeds of the garden she had raked with orange leaf through her hair. The handkerchief lay, embroidered silk her mother soaked to cool her brow and throat. The fever walked in circles through the eyes, fire nested in her feet.
Horúčka prechádzala v kruhoch skrz oči, v nohách sa ohniezdil oheň. Vytratila sa melódia tanca, v ktorú dúfala, že sa prebudí.
The term is reading a poem, but he's not reading a poem. It's in his body and spirit, and that's what I think the audience captures, regardless of their cultural background.
James Reagan is a beautiful poet. Everything falls into, every word falls into the right place. Every word. His poetry, I was reading because I was a student of his. I better go back home and look at my own poetry and see what this bum can do. He's marvelous.
I would term him more of an international humanitarian.
Let go of honored sky and earth. Let go the horizon in between. Lose all the sunlit undulations of the season's wheat and sing. Sing out to seeds, to grass, to all that breathes into the pores of stones. Let go the sovereign moons of space, the celestial laws of Ariels breathing out a planet and pulsing out its days. And where the stars ignite in showers, let them fall. Recite the moment's song that tomorrow wind will bring in squalls. Free the century's melody as you would a line or burden down a well. Allow the astonishment of living, one reed or willow feeding swallows through a hungry night until they weary of elation. Let all buckets fill, all loss be light. I saw two talking girls weaving rainbows in their eyes, and daughtering in me their dreams, I grew, astonished by all conception, by the frail grandeur of life.
Hello, Jimmy. How are you? Good to see you, my friend. You remember my daughter, Tamar? James, or as I call him, Jimmy, is a wonderful example of the role of poetry, because through his poems, writing so beautifully about his Slovak roots, his father, he has such deep memories of his father, his other family members, also Prague. He's, as an American poet with those roots, he's a bridge. Everybody comes to Prague to see the Charles Bridge, but I enjoy the Jimmy Bridge. He creates a poetry bridge between the United States and this part of the world. When he writes in his poem To the Sons of the West, a single word might heal, remembering how frayed the ill-knit bond between my vision and my will, remembering how high into the world's mind I'd gone. And these words provide a connection with the past, a healing connection, a connection between his roots and the poems, which are the flowers of those roots.
This board here at the Rogers Center, and the Fred Rogers Center, of course, is dedicated to the education of children. And Jim, this is right down Jim's alley because he's an educator. He's an educator through poetry, and he understands people. He understands human beings. He understands motivation. He understands people wanting to make a contribution. And he, in this board, does the same thing in this group that he does with his poetry.
He's just been a very well-respected figure nationally and internationally, and we're grateful that he agreed to join us in this effort. He has a long history of working in media, particularly in the area of Hollywood, and just brings a wealth of experience in helping us to understand how best to communicate this message that we are attempting to communicate to children and to families.
And so he was an obvious candidate to serve with this group of experts on assisting us with the program in early learning and children's media. But Jim's he came playing ball at St. Vincent, and you know, I think always loved language, but it kind of grew and nurtured here.
Jim lives literally all over the world, and he writes about what he sees and what he feels, and through his poetry and his work for the stage and for movies, he is inspiring us, drawing us to also see and to think and to feel things that we will not think, see, and feel with all of this shorthand media, that these headlines that I mentioned that come across our little screens every day. Most poetry is kind of an academic, it's in an academic world. Where do you see poetry written? In colleges, universities, high schools, but also maybe in an occasional journal. But Jim somehow has created relationships with people of authority and power, not only in the United States, but all over the world. He's a remarkable man.
Virgil once said that everything that has to be written, that needs to be written, has already been written. Goethe came back many centuries later and said, yes, Virgil, you're right, everything that needs to be written has been written, but since no one reads it, we must write it again.
And then later, this particular day escalated into what then became an occupation by the Warsaw Pact troops, and especially the Soviet troops.
We were just about to treat our hunger well when, out of sunlight, undeclared, a shaded mass of stone began to stretch its neck along the slope. It would scan the water for a quarter hour before the foliage rubbed its throat, some internal hunger now assuaged for only moments. Then again, the impulse thumbed like whalebone on a drum. The poplars began to rustle. A hawk, spiraling like an aspen deep in chatter, betrayed its nest to block the sun. The dam below rose up to bolder water, as if to show how easily wars are won.
I stayed here for a good while. This was during the early 70s. I did a lot of writing down here. A lot of the celebrities came this far out because in many ways, living here at Malibu, it stripped that surface face that they had to show to Hollywood, and they became themselves here. It was just, that was, I think, a very therapeutic and healing thing here. Is it because it was quiet and you were in the middle of nature? The water, the ocean was your backyard. You can just hear the rumbling of the water back and forth. There was a beautiful rhythm that was constant. And it was the rhythm of the body also, you see. And in terms of my poetry, it was the rhythm of my poetry. It all sort of came together as one for me.
Jim still writes, especially his poetry, with pen and paper. And so after we were married and I was no longer working in the courts, I became the person that would actually be the first to see his poems. Jim's poems are more universal, where he feels himself as a person of the world. So he writes from experiences of his travels or political issues. He likes breaking down borders, bringing people closer together. It's not writing always about me, but other issues.
Never call yourself a poet. Someone else must. I wanted to say something larger. It was never really about me. I didn't write that much just, oh, me. It was more about what I had known in the world and the people and the suffering. Very important, that word in my vocabulary was how to document the suffering that I saw as I traveled, whether it was in China, whether it was in Moscow during the Iron Curtain communist years, in my villages in Slovakia. Everything in us should be suffering with those who suffer. But let's start with the children, the education of children from a very early age. Start stopping these problems, to stop the prejudices.
I believe a lot of us teenagers and people my age, we all really respect and really love where we came from. I have a lot of respect for my grandparents and my father and for everyone in my heritage. Soon as I was born, I was already on a plane off to Europe. My dad has wanted me to be well-rounded with the world and be able to understand different cultures and how they act and how they live. So since I was a little boy, we've been going back to Prague and the Czech Republic and Slovakia just so I could go see my uncles and my grandparents, their brothers and sisters, that we always get a chance to go over there for a little bit and see how they live. And it means a lot.
When I was younger, this whole city was the steel mills, so all of the soot from the steel mills, all the smoke and the soot would just be all over the city. You couldn't see. It was so thick with smog.
Back then, I think most of the nationalities were close. But again, we were still friends with everybody in the city.
Jimmy is a boy was completely different than he is now. I mean, that kid I thought was going to go to the major leagues. He was such a good ball player. He played basketball, football, and baseball. Batted good, he fielded good, he had a good arm. And his team from Duquesne, a little town like this, went to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where they had teams from all over the country playing against each other for the championship of the United States. You've got to really congratulate him because, you know, for me, an athlete and him an athlete, I would never think about being a poet. But this guy here, he's really something.
No, when he was a kid, no, that was a real shock whenever he went into poetry. No inclination that he would end up writing. You know, he took a liking to it and then he started to write. We were proud of him.
When the mills closed down, then the city just totally deteriorated. Before that, it was beautiful. I mean, it was a nice, quaint town. Duquesne really was at that time. It was a mill town, but it was a very nice town. The only thing that really changed as we got older is that the family moved on. They moved to different states, but that's why we have that family reunion every year. But the mills when the mills went down here, the city really went down.
Oh my. This was my childhood, the choir, the beauty. This was such a beautiful church. Unbelievable. I've never seen anything. I never expected this. My brother used to sing from the choir here. It was a Slovak. That beautiful organ. They took all the pews and everything. How could this happen? And everything was painted. You know, up there, all of it was painted. Wow. I wanted to come and see because I thought it would still be something like it used to be, but this is... I would want the distance to all understanding to narrow just enough to fail at failure. I would want a melody of chances to learn to love again what first I dreamed, free as wonder, soft as touch, and of all things simple, to care again for them as much.
I think that poetry took on another force for me. It became something I could use to change my society, to heal that society because it was broken, quite broken, like in many ways it is today. And so I always look to the artist, whether it's the painters, whether it's the musicians, whether it's the poets or the novelists or the playwrights or the filmmakers, to be the necessary voice at a time when we need to hear those sensitivities. We need to hear people who have not just a passion for living a life of poetry, whether it's in their film, whether it's in their, whatever they're doing, painting, dancing, music. We need to hear that more.
Very good.
Yeah. Going to.
you.